مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تصادم معتاد للسياسات، تأتي مشكلة عاجلة وملحة، وأخرى غير عاجلة ولكن مهمة. فأيهما تقوم بحلها أولا؟ هل بالإمكان حل الإثنتين معا؟ عبر التاريخ ركز القادة السياسيون دائما على حل المشاكل العاجلة. طبعا هذا يعني أن المشاكل غير العاجلة تزداد سوءا، وقد تسوء أحيانا إلى درجة يسبق من المستحيل حلها. هذا هو حل التغيير المناخي. سابقا كانت البطالة هي المشكلة. لم يرغب السياسيون بإيقاف دعم الصناعات التي توظف عددا كبيرا من العمال لمساعدة الأمريكيين على انتقال من مصادر الطاقة التقليدية إلى الطاقة المتجددة. اليوم أصبحت أسعار الوقود المرتفعة مشكلة خارقة، وبشكل غريب فإن الإدارة ملتزمة بمكافحة التغيير المناخي، إلا أنها تحث منتجين على الضخ المزيد من النفط لحفظ أسعاره. فهل سنتصرف يوما بجدية حيال التغيير المناخي؟ هل هي مشكلة الغد أم أنها مشكلة اليوم؟ لمناقشة السياسات والسياسة التغيير المناخي يسرني أن أستقبل ضيفين، هما الصحفيان الشابان واللامعان زاك بودريك وزويا تيرستين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Climate change, the issue of our time. It's undoubtedly important, but is it urgent? Does it grasp the attention of policymakers the way it ought to? We're going to take a look at how the Biden administration has been balancing its various priorities with a focus on climate change with two outstanding young journalists, Zach Budrick and Zoya Tierstein. Thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. So
thank you for having us.
Let's take a look at the first year of the Biden administration before Ukraine, before the massive rise of inflation. How would you evaluate the administration's climate change policy in year one? What would you say were major achievements, if there were any? And then we'll get to some major disappointments. Zoya, let me start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that in the first year of the Biden administration, there was a great hope among environmentalists that he had this mandate from voters to tackle climate change. And he had put out several great ideas during the primaries. And so the first year was rather hopeful, I think, from a climate perspective. There were multiple bills floating around. Biden had this idea to inject a massive amount of spending into clean energy and other climate initiatives. And he decided to split that agenda up into two pieces. And that's sort of where things started to fall apart. And we can get to that later. But in the beginning, it seemed great. I mean, he managed to pass an infrastructure bill that has some climate components in it, but he removed most of them in order to get that bill passed with bipartisan support. And so, later after that first year, that's when he tried to sort of get that second piece moving with more of the climate elements, and that has unfortunately stalled out pretty drastically in the Senate. So, yeah.
So we have some achievements the first year. Zach, would you assess it any differently?
Yeah, I agree. With the extent to which the Build Back Better bill was probably, maybe depending on how the midterms shake out, the last best hope. Another thing that was initially a pleasant surprise for a lot of environmental advocates was the moratorium that he imposed, the temporary moratorium on new oil and gas leasing on federal lands. I think that a lot of them would probably have said that still didn't go far enough. Unfortunately, from an environmental perspective, it's just back to business in terms of leasing on federal lands at this point.
And so are there other items that would not have taken legislative approval, given how difficult it is to get anything through Congress these days, but are there items that are fully in the power of the executive branch that environmentalists had hoped to see in year one that they didn't get from President Biden?
I can take that one. I think actually sort of the opposite is true. I think that environmentalists were really rather pleased with how the Biden administration tackled things at the administrative level, at the administrative state. So basically what Biden has been doing for the past months that he's been in office is he's been working hard to sort of undo a lot of the damage that was done to, deregulate and sort of weaken environmental regulation under the Trump administration. So that's been, I think, heartening for environmentalists. And that's unfortunately, that's sort of been the extent of what the Biden administration has been able to do from a climate perspective. Again, he came into office with this sort of grand plan to tackle the climate crisis. And what you see right now is sort of the EPA, DOI, all these agencies that work under Biden to, create sort of a cohesive administrative state, working to sort of like repair some of the damage that was done. Just
for our viewers, that's the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Interior.
Yes. Apologies. Yeah, those are the acronyms I'm not supposed to say. So yeah, that's I think that's been a note of positivity in sort of the landscape of climate policy in the United States. But again, there is no federal emissions policy right now, which is what Biden had hoped to accomplish.
And Zach, if John Kerry were here, the sort of foreign policy climate change czar, would he look back on the first year as being a success or a disappointing year?
I think he'd probably be somewhat disappointed. And I think the big thing, which is something that he has come back to repeatedly, is that, we can't compel other big emitters such as China and India to do anything. And that is, that ends up coming back in the domestic political rhetoric. For example, a lot of Republicans who acknowledge the reality of climate change will say, will act like we're somehow being taken for a ride if we reduce our emissions, but get no such commitment from China and India. And I think that, from an international perspective, and this is something that Secretary Kerry has expressed a lot of frustration about himself, is, that's obviously the big international story of the moment is the Ukraine conflict, and that's a huge story with massive implications for hundreds of millions of people. But it also means that most other pressing international policy issues are somewhat taking a back burner, just because real people's lives are in danger on a daily basis in a way that makes it hard to get to the negotiating table on any other issue.
So that's what I want to shift gears now to focus on year two, which has really been already been taken over by two huge issues that are connected to a certain extent. One, Ukraine, and the other, our domestic inflation, which is really a global inflation affecting the economy. To what extent have these issues, you just touched on it, but to what extent have these issues affected the climate change agenda and the sense of urgency and the need and the ability of the administration to get things done on this front? Zoya?
Well, I think if you're an environmentalist in the US right now, you're probably tearing your hair out because the Biden administration has, as I mentioned, came into office with this plan. And now, due to these two issues that you just highlighted, is having to sort of figure out how to square its climate goals with these sort of what feels like much more concrete everyday needs that Americans are facing every day. So, inflation, rising gas prices, midterms are coming up. I think that for the Biden administration, and this has been documented by political scientists, that, when Americans are faced with that price, $5 a gallon, $7 a gallon in California, every day on the way to and from work, that really sticks with them. And voters have a lot to say about that. And that really impacts the way that they show up at the polls, who they vote for. So the Biden administration has to weigh these two prerogatives, tackling climate change and reducing gas prices. And in order to do that, as Zach mentioned, the Biden administration has opened up oil and gas leasing on public land, something that they said that they wouldn't do. On the campaign trail, Biden promised in the most emphatic way that a candidate can. He said, no more drilling on public lands ever, 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 basically. And so now, of course, he's backtracking on that. He's also, increased ethanol in gas, which is aimed to sort of decrease prices as well. And he's opened up a bunch of oil from strategic national reserves to sort of tackle the crisis. Many of those things that he's done. Oh, sorry. And now, just recently, he's thinking about, eliminating the gas tax for a while. So all of those things are sort of aimed at showing Americans that he is trying everything he can and everything in his power to reduce gas prices. Is it working? Not really. There's a limited supply of gas right now, basically, and that's the issue. And the war has really exacerbated that.
And the climate change agenda has taken a hit as a result of it. Zach, are there voices in the administration who are counseling stay the course on climate change?
I think that, maybe not in the administration per se, but there's a faction of members of Congress in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who I think really see this as an opportunity to, continue with the more ambitious goals of emissions reductions and mitigating climate change, and instead they've been talking a lot about a windfall profits tax on the major oil companies.
So when we come back after the break, we're going to take a closer look at how the Democratic Party itself lines up on this internal debate between addressing inflation and fighting climate change, and whether, what's the net effect of this on enthusiasm and energy as the party goes into the all-important November congressional elections in just a moment. It was a small-time crime, a break-in into the office of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Hotel on the banks of the Potomac River. An astute security guard saw something unusual, called the police, and the 5 culprits were apprehended. But this event, exactly 50 years ago this summer, was the tip of the iceberg of the biggest political conspiracy in American history. And before it was over, it took as its prime victim the presidency of Richard Nixon, one of our country's most durable politicians. He first served as vice president 20 years earlier, and the man who would go on to one of the greatest re-election victories ever, less than 5 months after the break-in. Along the way, Watergate launched the careers of 2 of America's most famous journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. It injected the adult movie phrase deep throat into the American political lexicon. And it gave us 2 sayings that have forever taken their place in the quotable quotes of American politics. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up. And the famous question Senator Howard Baker asked witnesses at special hearings over and over again: what did you know and when did you know it? Ever since Watergate, scandals in American politics only achieved national prominence when the media could append the term gate to them, like Koreagate, Nannygate, and White Watergate. But only one president has ever resigned in our history, and that's because there was only one Watergate. Again, my guests today include Zach Budrick. Zach is the energy and environment reporter for The Hill, newspaper covering Capitol Hill, and he is co-host of Stim for Stim, a relationship podcast for and by people on the autism spectrum. Also joining us is Zoya Tierstein. Zoya is the climate and public health reporter for GRIST. She has also reported for The Verge and Haaretz. All right, so let's turn to internal Democratic Party politics. Often it's the passionate minority that gets things done, that pushes agendas to the top of the political attention for our leaders. In this case, the environment element within the Democratic Party, but there's a broader voting group, which is the group that is going to vote in our elections in November. Talk about the politics of balancing between an emphasis on climate change and addressing the gas price inflation problem and how it will affect Democratic Party enthusiasm come November. Zach, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I hope this isn't too much of a colloquialism, but I think that there is a balance that they have to strike, in particular to avoid having sort of perceived as having a let them eat cake attitude towards things like renewable energy and electric vehicles. There was a bit of an unfortunate messaging stumble for the administration as gas prices began to surge, where Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Energy, made a remark to the impact of, well, people won't pay as much for gas if they're driving an electric car, which of course is prohibitively expensive for a lot of Americans. And I think that, and again, sort of the catch-22 is that people don't want to be told that they should just be driving less or that they should just be transitioning to renewable energy. But a lot of the enthusiasm within the Democratic base, that the enthusiasm that drove the turnout that elected Joe Biden president, is people who rank the environment, climate change as one of their top issues. So there's a real risk of making them feel abandoned and demotivated if those concerns are not addressed simply because there are concerns about being dismissive of voter concerns about gas prices.
When you look at voters' priorities, Zoya, where do you see climate change ranking for the general public and for voters who identify as Democrats?
Well, I think that there's been this sort of like inadvertent effect that when a Democrat becomes president, Democratic voters assume that the climate issue is under control. And you can see that in a number of ways. Democrats also, it's the midterms and their president is in office. So there's a chance that there's a likelihood actually that there will be lower voter turnout than there would be if Trump was in office, for example. And that I think has more of an effect than perhaps, inflation definitely has an effect, and gas prices also have an effect, and the war in Ukraine also has an effect. But I think probably the most important thing that sways the way voters show up is, who's the incumbent, and Biden's the incumbent. So I think there's a fair shot that Republicans will see a much stronger turnout in the midterm elections, and they're going to be a lot more passionate about the issues that they care about. And for them, climate change has been an increasing concern, but not one that ranks higher than, gas prices, inflation, budgets, all kinds of spending that doesn't have to do with climate.
Is there anything that you think the administration could be doing that would excite the base on this set of issues and still retain its focus on trying to bring down gas prices and trying to fight inflation? Either of you?
That's a tough question, Zach. Do you know the answer to that? I think that if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a hot commodity. I think honestly, this is what energy experts have told me. So they are obviously biased. But they say that by sort of championing a transition to renewable energy as an alternative to fossil fuels, by saying, hey, if we were reliant on wind and solar and other forms of energy, nuclear, hydro, within the US, we wouldn't have to depend on other places for oil and gas.
Okay, well, we're going to have to stop there. We've run out of time. I want to thank you very much, Zoya and Zach, for helping explain the connection between climate change and politics in the run-up to these November elections. Thank you for joining us on Dachel, Washington. Gasoline prices are going through the roof. Americans are angry, and the Biden administration is scrambling to do something about it. For the first time ever, the average price of a gallon of gas is more than $5. That's $2 more than it was just a year ago. This is a vivid reminder of the problem with the idea of energy independence. Yes, we can pump enough oil for Americans, but energy is a global market. So what happens in faraway places like Ukraine and Saudi Arabia affects the price we pay for the oil that comes out of the ground in Texas and Oklahoma. There's a lot more Americans should know about the price of a gallon of gas that they don't know. First, almost half of that price has nothing to do with gas. According to the Energy Information Administration, 56% of the price of gasoline in the United States goes toward paying for the oil, while 15% goes to taxes, 16% for distribution and marketing, and 14% the cost of refining. Second, taxes. Everyone talks about taxes. In some states, governors are calling for a tax holiday, and indeed, we may even have a federal tax holiday. Are taxes for gasoline high? Well, not compared to the rest of the world. The result is that a gallon of gas in America is the lowest of all the major industrialized nations. What costs $5 in America is more than $8 in most of Europe, more than $10 in Norway and Denmark, more than $11 in Hong Kong. And the difference in price is almost all due to tax. For them, that's certainly a lot to complain about. Third, compared to most countries, gas in America is relatively affordable. That means when you view it as a percentage for what people actually spend on life's essentials, in America, it's very low. According to the most recent statistics that I looked at, the cost of a tank full of gas is just 0.9%, less than 1% of an American's average monthly income, ranking us fourth in the world in affordability. It eats up more than twice that amount in Britain and Canada, more than 3 times that amount in France and Italy. Everything I just said is factually true and accurate, and I wanted to tell this story to provide some perspective about where America fits in with the rest of the world. But none of it really matters, because all politics, as we've said before on this channel so many times, all politics is local. Americans don't compare themselves to Brits, Danes, or Norwegians. They compare themselves to themselves. They compare today to yesterday. Promises of how bad things could be don't measure up to comparisons between how they are and how they used to be. It's an iron law of politics, and it's one of the main reasons why Joe Biden and his political advisors are staying up late at night. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن السياسة والتبادل المناخي في أمريكا اليوم، تراسلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.